At 34 years old, David Carter had no address, no office, no savings, no business. Most nights his entire life fit inside a single backpack. He slept wherever he could, sometimes on a friend's couch, sometimes in the back seat of his aging car, and sometimes with no idea where he would spend the next night. He became an expert at parking in quiet places where nobody would ask questions, an expert at pretending everything was fine, an expert at waking up before sunrise so no one would realize he had spent the night there. Just a few years earlier, he had believed his life was finally moving in the right direction. A steady career, a growing income, plans for the future, a life that finally felt stable. Then everything unraveled. One setback became another. A lost job turned into mounting debt. Debt became missed payments. Missed payments became eviction. And before he could fully understand what was happening, David found himself losing something he had never imagined living without: a place to call home. People looked at him and saw another man who had failed. Another dream that hadn't worked out. Another person the world had already stopped believing in. What nobody saw was what David carried inside that worn-out backpack. Not money, not expensive equipment, not a laptop filled with investor presentations. Just an old notebook filled with ideas, page after page of observations, problems nobody seemed interested in solving, solutions nobody had asked for, ideas written during the hardest months of his life, ideas that, 7 years later, would take him into boardrooms with some of the biggest companies in the world. At 41 years old, the same man who had once been sleeping in his car was sitting across from CEOs, signing contracts worth millions of dollars with industry giants. Looking back, people called it an incredible comeback, but they missed the most important part. The company wasn't born after David got his life back. It was born while he was still losing it. And that's what makes this story so extraordinary. But to understand how a homeless man ended up negotiating with Fortune 500 CEOs, we have to go back to the day everything fell apart. This is his story. There was nothing extraordinary about David Carter's early life. He wasn't born into poverty, but he certainly wasn't born into wealth either. He grew up believing what millions of people are taught to believe: study hard, get a stable job, work hard, build a comfortable life. For a while that plan worked. After college, David landed a respectable position at a logistics company. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. He showed up early, stayed late, volunteered for projects nobody else wanted. Managers noticed. Promotions followed. Year after year, his responsibilities grew. He worked his way into management, earned the respect of his co-workers, built a reputation as someone people could rely on when things became difficult. Slowly, his life began to resemble the future he had always imagined. He bought a small apartment, nothing luxurious, but it was his. Started putting money into savings every month, and for the first time he began thinking seriously about starting a family. Those were the years when life felt predictable, comfortable, safe, but stability can disappear much faster than people imagine. The first signs were easy to ignore. The company announced a restructuring. Management described it as a strategic adjustment. Departments were merged, budgets became tighter, people began whispering in the hallways. Then entire teams disappeared. Friends David had worked with for years quietly packed their desks and walked out carrying cardboard boxes. He told himself his position was secure. After all, his performance had always been strong. Surely that would be enough. Then, on a rainy Friday afternoon, an email appeared on his screen. Please report to conference room B at 3 p.m. He already knew what it meant. The meeting lasted less than 20 minutes, a few carefully rehearsed sentences, a severance package, a handshake, an apology that sounded more procedural than sincere, and just like that, he walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box. At first he wasn't worried. He had experience, strong references, confidence. Finding another job wouldn't take long. Or so he thought. Weeks became months. Interviews became polite rejection emails. Some companies never called back. Others praised his resume before choosing someone else. Meanwhile, life refused to pause. Rent was still due. Credit card balances grew larger every month. His savings account, once a source of comfort, slowly became a countdown clock. Then came the hardest decisions: selling the furniture, selling electronics he had worked years to afford. Each sale bought him a little more time, but not enough. Eventually, he couldn't afford the apartment anymore. At 34 years old, David packed everything he still owned into 2 worn-out bags. He walked slowly through the empty rooms one last time. The walls echoed now. The shelves were bare. He stood at the front door for a long moment, locked it one final time, placed the keys in the landlord's hand, and walked away carrying everything that remained of his life. He didn't know it then, but that quiet afternoon, the one that felt like the end of everything, would eventually become the beginning of the greatest comeback of his life. Homelessness doesn't always look the way people imagine. It doesn't always mean sleeping on sidewalks or holding a cardboard sign on a street corner. Sometimes it looks like wearing clean clothes to a job interview while secretly wondering where you'll sleep that night. Sometimes it looks like showering at a public gym before meeting potential employers. Sometimes it looks like smiling at former co-workers while carefully avoiding any questions about where you're living. David became an expert at pretending everything was fine. Every morning he woke up before sunrise, not because he wanted to, because he didn't want anyone noticing he had spent the night in his car. He folded the blanket, packed his backpack, straightened his shirt, and tried to look like every other person walking into the city for work. He spent mornings sending resumes, afternoons sitting in public libraries using free internet, evenings walking through coffee shops just to stay somewhere warm for another hour. Whenever he could afford it, he bought the cheapest cup of coffee on the menu. Not because he wanted coffee, because it gave him a place to sit, a place to think, a place where nobody asked questions. And almost every night, before going to sleep, he opened the same notebook he carried everywhere. He wrote, not because he believed anyone would ever read it, but because writing was the only thing that made him feel like his future still existed. There were nights when giving up seemed completely reasonable. Nights when another rejection email felt like proof that his old life wasn't coming back. Friends wanted to help. Some offered him a couch, others offered temporary work. A few quietly handed him grocery money without making him feel embarrassed. David appreciated every gesture, but he didn't want people feeling sorry for him. He wanted another chance, so he accepted whatever work he could find. Freelance projects, warehouse shifts, short-term contracts, anything that paid enough to keep moving forward. And something unexpected began to happen. Working with dozens of different businesses exposed him to something he had never noticed before. Almost every small company was struggling with the same problems. Their operations were chaotic. Inventory systems were outdated. Orders disappeared. Employees spent hours fixing mistakes that software should have prevented in seconds. Owners were exhausted. Not because they lacked ambition, because they were wasting enormous amounts of time fighting inefficient systems. David couldn't stop noticing it. Every temporary job revealed the same pattern. Different companies, different industries, exactly the same frustrations. So he started writing everything down, page after page, problems, patterns, possible solutions, without realizing it. The notebook that had once been filled with random observations was slowly becoming something much more valuable. It was becoming a blueprint. A blueprint for a company that didn't exist yet. A company born not from comfort, but from one of the hardest seasons of David's life. Take a second and think about this. Imagine being 34 years old, no home, no savings, no steady job, no idea where you'll be sleeping next week. Most people would spend every waking moment trying to survive. David did something different. He started planning a future that nobody else could see. And inside that old notebook, he had already begun writing the first pages of a company that would one day change his life. Subscribe if you haven't yet. We publish a brand new business story every single day. Now let's find out how a man with nothing turned a backpack full of ideas into contracts with some of the biggest companies in the world. One afternoon, while sitting alone in a public library, David opened the notebook that had become his closest companion. He wasn't looking for inspiration. He was simply trying to make sense of everything he had been writing for months. Page after page told the same story. Different companies, different products, different industries. Yet somehow, they all complained about the same operational problems. Orders getting lost, inventory systems that didn't communicate with each other, employees wasting hours on tasks that should have taken minutes. At first, David thought they were isolated issues. Now he realized they weren't. They were symptoms of the same broken system. And suddenly something clicked. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the notebook. For months he had been asking the wrong question. Who is going to hire me? Now he found himself asking a completely different one. What if I stop waiting to be hired? And start building something people actually need? When he shared the idea, the reactions were exactly what you would expect. You don't even have a place to live, and you want to start a company? Get another corporate job first. Wait until things become stable again. Later. David had heard that word his entire life. But after everything he had been through, he realized something. Later isn't a date on the calendar for many people. It's where dreams quietly go to disappear. He had spent months waiting for someone else to give him another opportunity. Now, he decided to create one himself. He borrowed old laptops whenever friends would lend them, worked from public libraries, coffee shops, anywhere with electricity and an internet connection. He relied on free software whenever possible, watched online tutorials late into the night, taught himself skills he couldn't afford to pay someone else for. Every obstacle forced him to become more resourceful. Slowly, the idea inside the notebook began turning into something real. The first version of the platform was painfully simple. The design wasn't impressive. The interface was rough. It crashed more often than David wanted to admit, but beneath all the imperfections, the product did something that mattered. It solved a real problem. Business owners immediately understood its value. Not because it looked revolutionary, because it made their lives easier. And David had learned something that many entrepreneurs spend years trying to understand. People rarely buy the most impressive product. They buy the one that solves their problem. That simple realization became the foundation of everything that followed. David still had no idea, but the notebook he had filled during the hardest season of his life was about to become the blueprint for a company that would change everything. The first customer arrived almost by accident. A small business owner heard about David's software through a mutual friend. He agreed to try it, not because the company looked impressive, because the problem was real. The results spoke for themselves. The business became more organized. Employees wasted less time. Orders were processed faster. The owner immediately noticed the difference. Then he told another business owner, then another. The company grew the way David had always hoped it would. Not through expensive advertising, not through flashy marketing campaigns, but through trust. One satisfied customer became 5, 5 became 20, 20 became hundreds. Business owners trusted the product because it had been built by someone who actually understood their frustrations. David wasn't selling features. He was solving problems he had personally watched people struggle with for years. That made all the difference. Every conversation with a customer became another opportunity to make the product better. Every complaint became an update. Every suggestion became another improvement. Within a few years, companies that had once ignored David were requesting product demonstrations. Industry conferences invited him to speak. Investors who had never returned his phone calls suddenly wanted meetings. But the moment that truly changed everything came 7 years after David had handed back the keys to his apartment. One Monday morning, he parked outside the headquarters of one of the largest corporations in the country. For a brief moment, he simply sat inside the car. Not because he was nervous, because he couldn't stop thinking about where he had been 7 years earlier. There had been a time when his car wasn't transportation. It was home. Now it had brought him somewhere he had never imagined. He walked through the front doors carrying a leather portfolio instead of a backpack. The security guard greeted him by name. An executive escorted him to the boardroom, not for a job interview, not to ask for help, but to finalize a partnership agreement worth millions of dollars. The meeting lasted less than an hour. The signature took only a few seconds. But those few seconds represented 7 years of sacrifice. 7 years of uncertainty. 7 years of believing in an idea almost nobody else believed in. Soon after, another industry giant signed. Then another. Each new partnership opened doors that had once seemed permanently closed. And the notebook, that had once been filled with handwritten observations, had become the foundation of a business trusted by some of the biggest companies in the industry. The man who had once struggled to find a place to sleep was now sitting across the table from CEOs, negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts as an equal. Years earlier, people had seen a homeless man carrying a backpack. They had no idea. He was carrying the first draft of a company that would eventually change his life. At 41 years old, David Carter often found himself thinking about the previous 7 years, not because he missed them, but because he never wanted to forget them. The company had grown beyond anything he had imagined. Hundreds of employees, clients across multiple industries, long-term contracts with some of the largest corporations in the country. But that wasn't what made him most proud. Money had changed his circumstances. It hadn't become his definition of success. The old notebook he had once carried, because it was all he had, still sat on a shelf inside his office. Its pages were worn. The cover was faded. Visitors occasionally asked why he kept such an old notebook instead of displaying awards or expensive trophies. David always smiled, because that notebook meant more than any award ever could. It reminded him of the man who refused to stop believing when there was almost nothing left to believe in. Years later, young entrepreneurs began asking him for advice. Many expected complicated business strategies or secrets about raising capital. Instead, David usually gave them the same answer. Never underestimate what you can build during the hardest season of your life. Then he would explain, because that's exactly what had happened to him. The business wasn't created after his life improved. It was created while everything was still falling apart, without losing his job. He never would have seen the problem without losing his apartment. He never would have carried that notebook everywhere he went. Without those endless days spent working temporary jobs, he never would have discovered that businesses across completely different industries were struggling with exactly the same challenges. The life he thought was falling apart had actually been teaching him how to build a better one. Success didn't arrive the day he signed his first multi-million-dollar contract. It arrived much earlier, the day he decided that his circumstances would never have the final word. Years earlier, people saw a homeless man carrying a backpack. Years later, they saw the founder of one of the fastest-growing companies in the industry. David saw something different. He saw the same man, the same determination, the same curiosity, the same notebook. The only thing that had changed was that the rest of the world had finally caught up with the vision he had written inside those pages years before. 7 years before David signed contracts with some of the biggest companies in the country. Everything he owned fit inside a single backpack. The world saw a homeless man carrying his belongings. What nobody saw was that he was also carrying the first chapter of the life he was about to build. Your circumstances don't define your potential. They never have. What matters is what you decide to do inside them. Subscribe to Profit and Peril for more stories like this one. And leave a comment. Have you ever built something important during the hardest season of your life? I read every single one. Come back tomorrow. The next story might change the way you think.